So tonight we're going to talk about conscience in the Christian life. The title is The Aboriginal Vicar of Christ, which is what John Henry Newman called the conscience. Just like the Pope is the Vicar of Christ, the conscience is the Aboriginal Vicar of Christ. But before we begin to talk about conscience, we really got to pay attention. I've discovered we really must pay attention to a momentous revolution in human thought, which goes unnoticed mostly. We don't have time to get into the details of this revolution in human thought, but it's a revolution which overturned basically everything we understand about logic and law and God and the universe. As I said, basically everything. And we must pay attention how in the West it affected particularly our understanding of freedom, right? And so before we begin, we've got to think about how our grasp, our understanding of freedom changed. At one point in Western history, we conceived of freedom one way, and then after a certain point in time, we thought of it another way, right? And that's part of this larger sort of philosophical revolution that I'm talking about. And to help us understand this, we'll see why it makes sense when we talk about conscience as we go on. One of the best people to help me sort of get through it quickly is an Orthodox thinker. His name's David Bentley Hart, a very brilliant guy, sometimes too brilliant, I think. But a wonderful book called Atheist Delusions, if you've never read it, where he describes the classical idea of freedom and then this modern idea of freedom to help us understand what I'm talking about, how freedom, our idea of freedom changed. So this first paragraph, dive in if you don't have a handout there in the back. David Bentley Hart describes classical freedom this way. He says, in the more classical understanding of the matter, whether pagan or Christian, true freedom was understood as something inseparable from one's nature. To be truly free was to be at liberty to realize one's proper essence, and so flourish as the kind of being one was. You'll remember last week we talked about nature and sequi naturam, as it's called, how things according to nature was part of the way we thought about morality. True human freedom is, Hart goes on, is emancipation from whatever constrains us from living the life of rational virtue or from experiencing the full fruition of our nature. And among the things that constrain us are our own untutored passions, our willful surrender to momentary impulses, our foolish or wicked choices. This means that we are not free merely because we can choose, but only when we have chosen well. Right? That's very important. So think of my illustration from last week about the brick and the bread, right? For those of you who weren't here, if to illustrate how the internal principles of choice, to talk like Thomas Aquinas, if you have bread and a brick on the table, your intellect tells you, okay, that's a brick and that's a bread. That's a loaf of bread, unless I've been fooled, And your will drives you to eat, lets you know you're hungry. You strive to flourish as an organism. That's your will. But you have free choice, right? You have free will, right? It would be utterly stupid of me to bite into the brick, right? I'd break my teeth, right? But I could if I wanted to, right? That's free will, right? And so think of that example from last week. We would say that I am free in the classical sense if I've chosen well by eating the bread and not the stupid thing like the brick, right? If I ate the brick, that would be enslaved by ignorance. When I use my freedom in order to choose, this is the point, this is the classical understanding of freedom. When I use my freedom, my free will, to choose in order to follow the well-formed intellect and will, then I'm truly free. Why? Because I am doing something that has truly helped me to flourish as a human being, right? Because I've chosen well. That's freedom in the classical sense. And like I said, this is the ancient idea of freedom, which held sway really right up through Thomas Aquinas. After Thomas, however, shortly after Thomas, there was another idea of freedom which emerged, right? And this newer idea essentially defined freedom as freedom without needing to be attached to the intellect and the will, right? Whereas, classically freedom was what a person achieved when he or she acted in accordance with the intellect and the will. This newer idea of freedom was merely just free will, the freedom to choose, right? Whether or not it accorded with the intellect or the will, right? So again, it helps to remember what we talked about last week, Thomas Aquinas' internal principles of human action, right? We're body and soul composite, we're humans with an intellect which knows truth, which is wired to truth. I can't not know that that's a brick unless someone really fools me, right? I have will, I have desire, right? We're a desiring organism to survive, to eat, to thrive, to grow. But we have this thing, and humans have this thing, and that's freedom. Freedom to choose. And the ancient idea, as I said, was if you choose well, according to the truth that this is bread, right? And that's good for you, then you're free, right? After that, after this revolution in thought, freedom is just choosing whatever you want, right? No matter whether it's the brick or the bread, you've chosen, you're free, right? And so Bentley Hart describes in this next paragraph very well the modern idea of freedom. We live in an age, the next two paragraphs actually, we live in an age whose chief value has been determined by overwhelming consensus to be the inviolable liberty of personal volition, personal willing. The right to decide for ourselves what we shall believe, want, need, own, or serve. The will we habitually assume is sovereign to the degree that it is obedient to nothing else and is free to the degree that it is truly spontaneous and constrained by nothing greater than itself. This, for many of us, is the highest good imaginable. The next paragraph, freedom for us today is something transcendent even of reason, and we no longer really feel that we must justify our liberties by recourse to some prior standard of responsible rationality. So returning to the bread and the brick image that we talked about last week, according to classical thought, as I said, I could only be free if I choose the bread, right? Because the bread is good for me as a human person, right? The brick will break my teeth. If I ate the brick, again, according to classical understandings of freedom, I would be a slave to ignorance, right? I would not be free. I'd be doing something very dumb, But according to modern thought, that's changed a little bit. According to modern thought, I'm free only if I choose whatever I choose for the sheer sake of choosing, right? That's the modern idea of freedom. And so if I choose without being burdened by anything like my will, which tells me I want to be healthy and happy, then I'm free according to modern thought. If I choose without being bothered by, even the canons of my intellect, which would tell me that a brick is a dumb thing to eat, then I'm free. according to modern thought. If I choose anything against sort of the external forces of law or tradition or church, then I'm free, right? You definitely wouldn't want to be coerced, right? Even if it's good advice. So according to modern thought, it's modern idea of freedom, which is freedom just purely to choose. If I ate the brick, I would be free because I truly chose it. I freely chose it, right? But if I ate the bread because your mom told you to, or custom, or reason, or law, even if it was good for you, according to the modern idea of freedom, I would not be free, I'd be coerced, right? And so this subtle change in what we understand freedom to be is underneath almost everything we think today, right? Again, and we'll stop with dear old David Bentley Hart with this last summary. He said, "We trust that there is no substantial criterion by which to judge our choices that stands higher than the unquestioned good of free choice itself, and that therefore all judgment, divine no less than human, is in some sense an infringement upon our freedom." This is our primal, modern, we mean, ideology. So I bring this idea of the change in the notion of freedom to your attention, one, because it's a good thing to notice in all sorts of ways, but also to help us clear up some of the habitual and unreflective assumptions we have sometimes about conscience when we talk about conscience. We can't simply identify conscience with what Pope Benedict called superficial conviction, right? We can't, he also referred to sort of modern articulations of conscience as not just superficial conviction, but pseudo-rational certainty, right? That's not conscience, Benedict is quite clear to say. Your conscience is not simply your free will. At all. It is, as we'll see, the conscience is the touch point between the individual and God, right? As the title of the talk, which I stole from Newman, goes, it's the conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ, speaking to the person. And then I say this again to point out why we have such problems with authority, right? Why we have such problematic notions of authority. Hannah Arendt said once in an essay on authority, she said, of course in modernity, we can't ask what authority is, we have to ask what authority was. Because we moderns can't conceive of it anymore, right? Because if freedom is just the freedom to choose, whether or not it's smart or good for you, when that's freedom in the modern sense, everything else is arbitrary. Everything else is authoritarian, everything else is coercion, whether it's law, whether it's custom, whether it's church, whether it's your neighbor, right? Law no longer becomes, as it was defined, as we saw last week by Thomas Aquinas, law no longer is an ordinance of reason, right? Thomas said a law should make sense. But if freedom in this modern ideology is just freedom to choose, then everything is just force or persuasion, right? Which is why I personally think in modernity you have ubiquitous advertising, right? That's why you have advertising everywhere, because of this modern notion of freedom. And again, it also changes the way we think about God, right? If law is no longer an ordinance of reason, if divine law is just something external that basically sort of coerces you, well, then you quickly conceive of God as some sort of mean, nasty deity up in the sky who just can bully you down, right? The God of modern atheism is this sort of false, strange idea of God, right? But that's another topic. So hold that right there, right? This poorly articulated difference between classical ideas of freedom and modern ideas of freedom, because it sits at the back of all our discussion about conscience. So moving on to conscience itself, which is what you guys came for. To talk about conscience from the Hebrew Scriptures, from the Old Testament onward, is to talk about the heart, right? That's the lingua franca of conscience in the Old Testament. The idiom of the heart. They didn't possess the language of conscience. They would inherit that. We would inherit that as people of faith from the Greeks later, and we'll see exactly when that came about. For the Hebrew mind, it was the heart, right? And you see it here in several very brief passages from Psalm 95. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. There in Job, I hold fast my righteousness and will not let it go. My heart does not reproach me for any of my days. So we see a few things there, right? Psalm 95, if you hear his voice, harden not your hearts. So the heart is obviously something in which God and the person sort of communicate, right? There's some sort of connection there. And in Job, the heart, it says, my heart does not reproach me for any of my days. So the heart there, in that sentence, is functioning as kind of like an organ for memory, you know? So the heart is this thing that hears God, and either is hard or fleshy, you know? But it's also the heart is something which testifies to God, right? My memory is good in front of the Lord, right? There in Ezekiel, this is God speaking through the prophet. I will give them one heart and a new spirit I will put within them. I will remove the heart of stone from their flesh and give them a heart of flesh, that they may walk in my statutes and keep my rules and obey them, that they may be my people and I will be their God, right? So again, the heart is that thing in which we stand before God and in which he speaks to us. Very simple. There's no sort of overly articulate theology going on here, right? And this language of the heart is the language Jesus used, right? For one instance, there in Matthew 15, this people honors me with the lips, but their heart is far from me. Jesus, being a good Jew, used the idiom of the Hebrews to talk about the heart. So it was the heart which communed with the divine, very, very simply. The language of the intellect and the will, which we talked a lot about last week with Thomas Aquinas and all that. We inherited that language from the Greeks, that vocabulary from Greek thought. And the reason we did that as Christians is because Paul did it, and others, and other writers of the New Testament. Paul identified this Hebrew language of the heart, and he identified it with sort of Greek psychological terminology, right? So that's where we get the word conscience, and intellect and will and all that stuff. The Septuagint, which we talked about a long time ago, is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And it translates the Hebrew word for heart as cardia, right? Leb in Hebrew and cardia in Greek. When Jesus talks about hardness of heart, you've heard me talk about this before. The Greek word for hard-heartedness is sclerocardia, like sclerosis, which I love that word. And so Paul, when he came across the word cardia, would identify this with a Greek word called synodesis. And this word synodesis just means knowing with, right? Sin, idea, that sort of thing. And this was language which was common in Greek literature at the time of Paul. And he used this word synodesis a ton in his letters, like 30 plus times. And in his letter to the Romans, he explicitly identifies the Hebrew concept of heart with the Greek concept of synodesis, which, as I said, means knowing with, right? And what Paul's talking about is synodesis, the heart. It's simply the intellectual organ of moral deliberation, right? Which is a technical way to describe what the Hebrew Scriptures describe more poetically. Conscience in Paul does what it does in the Hebrew Scriptures. It bears a twofold witness, right? So conscience bears witness to the person of God's law, right? It's in the conscience that you hear God's law, that you feel God's law, right from wrong and all that stuff. But conscience, just as you saw there in Job, bears witness to God, right? Of the soul's obedience, of the person's obedience, right? And we still have this in our own language today, So I can stand here in good conscience. We say, that's what Paul's talking about, right? So you see this passage in Romans 2, chapter 2, that describes a little bit what I'm talking about. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, right? So you see this pairing of cardia and synodesis. And their conflicting thoughts accuse them or even excuse them on that day when, according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Christ Jesus. He does this elsewhere, like in Romans 9 and places like that. But Paul's not the only one. You see here in John, in 1 John 3, by this we shall know that we are of the truth and reassure our heart before him. For whenever our heart condemns us, God is greater than our heart, and he knows everything. Beloved, if our heart does not condemn us, we have confidence before God, and whatever we ask, we receive from him, because we keep his commandments and do what pleases him, right? So again, that twofold witness. Conscience bears witness to us of God's law within ourselves, and it bears witness of our conscientiousness, our fidelity to God's law, to God himself, right? We could stop right there, but we're not going to. That's a really important thing about what conscience is. Very simple. So, as I said, the Bible, it's a simple vocabulary. It's a very, very simple vocabulary for what we today call conscience. The Old Testament refers to it as the heart, and the New Testament sort of brings in and identifies it with this Greek terminology of conscience. But this vocabulary would not remain undeveloped, to put it that way. Within a few centuries after the New Testament, Christian thought would add even more nuance to the vocabulary that we use when we talk about conscience. Now, the mystery of the human conscience is primeval. It's with us. It's part of who we are as humans. But in the history of sort of thought, in the history of theology and philosophy, the way we've talked about conscience has become more, I shouldn't say sophisticated, but more articulate over time. And that is thanks to our friend St. Jerome, whom we've talked about before. Every time St. Jerome's feast day comes around, which is coming up, I always talk about how you can be assured that you would not have liked him, and nor would I, because he was a pretty arrogant dude, but smart, so I guess he could get away with it. And it's St. Jerome who added nuance to our understanding of conscience by either discovering a new word or inventing it, and this word is synteresin. And we see this in this paragraph from St. Jerome. He says, the Greeks call synteresin, which is the spark of conscience, which was not extinguished even in Cain after his expulsion from paradise, and which we succumb to pleasures or frenzy, are sometimes deceived by semblance of reason, we still realize we are sinning. So this is a scholarly debate which is of interest to about 5 people on the planet, so it's not all that important. But it's a debate on whether or not Jerome invented this word synteresin. It would later become the word synderesis because of probably a copyist's error, although a lot of scholars argue against that too. In any case, Jerome pointed out this word synteresin, which is not synderesis. I'm sorry, I'm throwing a lot of Greek. It's not the word that Paul used. It's a different word, synteresin, right? And it would become part of the moral vocabulary of the West. The word comes from syntero, which means to keep and to preserve, to observe, you know. And by this word, synteresin, Jerome meant to describe what we call a faculty within the human person. He calls it the spark of conscience, right? And it's this knowledge of right and wrong that a person always possesses and never can lose, right? No matter how morally deformed a person may get, you know. So after Jerome, conscience takes on a little bit more nuance, right? So you have this older Pauline concept of synodesis, which is knowing with, which was identified with the Hebrew concept of the heart. And Paul sort of meant this in terms of sort of the action of making prudential judgments and things like that. And synderesis, which, synteresin, this is all very confusing, I understand. Synderesis, which is what synteresin became because of, as I said, copyist error, came to describe this habit or this faculty, this innate capacity within a person for truth, right? The spark of conscience, right? That's what Jerome gives to the tradition. And although this isn't sort of explicit in the Catechism, it certainly is present, this nuance, as we'll see. And it's certainly present in Thomas Aquinas, as we spent time with Thomas last week, there in question 79 of the first part of the Summa. And he talks about the conscience as a habit and an act, right? Conscience is both a habit, this is the Jerome spark thing, and an act. This is the Paul knowing with thing, right? So you see here in Thomas, but synderesis inclines to good only. Synderesis is not a power, but a habit. This is very Jerome-like language. But then he goes on to say, properly speaking, conscience is not a power, but an act. For conscience is said to witness, to bind, to incite, and also to accuse, to torment, or rebuke. And so by the time you get to the Middle Ages, you get this sort of nuanced, developed idea of conscience, right? And it all goes back to this idea of the heart. You know, the heart is where God speaks to us and where we bear witness to our righteousness, or our fidelity rather, to Him. It's a knowing with, it's a synodesis, but it's also this spark, it's this thing, this capacity for knowing right and wrong, you know, no matter how deformed you get morally, right? And this is Catholic thought today, right? This is the Catholic understanding of conscience to this very day. And again, you know, before we move on to modern Catholic teaching, you know, I just want to emphasize this, you know, this passage from Augustine sums up this idea of the spark of conscience, the permanence of conscience in the human person. There in Augustine he says, "For when will they be able to understand that there is no soul, however wicked, which can yet by reason in any way, in whose conscience God does not speak? For who but God has written the law of nature into the hearts of men." Now, just to hammer that home, because I think this is a really beautiful part of Catholic teaching. As Catholics, we believe that every single person has a conscience, right? You know, we often casually say about really bad people, oh, he has no conscience. As Catholics, we don't believe that, right? There is such things as mental illness, and we understand that. But as Catholics, we believe that every human being has a conscience by virtue of being a human being, right? And so a person can be wicked and morally depraved, but a person cannot exist without a conscience. And as I said, I think that's one of the most beautiful things about this teaching, right? About Catholic understanding of the human person, because to accept that even the worst person has a conscience is to give reason to hope for the best, right? Even in the worst. And so, to believe in the permanence of conscience in people, is to believe what I heard Sister Helen Prejean say once, from Dead Man Walking fame, where she said, when she sits down and visits with death row inmates, she understands, she said, that this person's worth more than the worst thing he's ever done in his life, right? This person's worth more than the worst thing he's ever done in his life, right? And as Catholics, we have to believe that. We fundamentally believe that, right? Which is why going to prisons is a good thing, right? Because of what we understand about the human person. So conscience always remains, and so therefore, so does truth, so does hope. Right? I just find that really lovely. So moving on very swiftly to modern Catholic teaching, really we can just go through them and you can hear the echoes of Hebrew and early Christian thought, particularly from the Catechism, which is basically quoting Gaudium et Spes from Vatican II. It says this, it says, deep within his conscience, man discovers a law which is laid not upon himself, but which he must obey. Its voice ever calling him to love and to do what is good and to avoid evil sounds in his heart at the right moment. For man has in his heart a law inscribed by God. His conscience is man's most secret core and his sanctuary. There he is alone with God, whose voice echoes in the depths. You can hear everything we've just talked about in those lines. In this next paragraph, you can detect that nuance of conscience about being both habit and act that you see in Thomas. Conscience is something that we have at the heart of the person, but it also is an act judging particular choices, as it says. It says moral conscience present at the heart of the person. There's Jerome for you. Enjoins him at the appropriate moment to do good and to avoid evil. It also judges particular choices. Here's synodesis from the Pauline sense, approving that those that are good and denouncing those that are evil. It bears witness to the authority of truth in reference to the supreme good to which the human person is drawn, and it welcomes the commandments. The 10 Commandments, the Decalogue, the law of God, by the way, bears witness to this, and the conscience ideally recognizes that. When he listens to the conscience, the prudent man can hear God speaking, right? So again, if today you hear his voice, harden not your hearts, right? So it's all the same stuff. So conscience, the church is clear, must be formed, and it must be developed, it must be shaped, it must be guided. Much like the virtues of a good shortstop, like we talked about last week, right? Elvis Andrus is a gift of nature. I don't know who the shortstop is these days, but he's a gift of nature, right? But he had to be coached, he had to be trained. Like Derek Jeter, Derek Jeter had to be coached and had to be trained. He couldn't rely on his natural talents, however awesome they were, right? And had he never been coached and never been guided, you would have never heard of Derek Jeter, right? This is true with the conscience as well, with all the moral being of the child. And again, I think about this in terms of raising, kids. Parents know they should that they have to bring up their kid in the light of some system of values, whether they're Christian values or secular values or the values of some other faith. If they don't think that through, it will be the values of YouTube and TikTok, and good luck with that. To be moral as a human being is to receive moral training. Every human on the planet is subject to that, right? Again, just as an aside, if you read Iris Murdoch, who is a very interesting person, her Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals, her Gifford lectures, at the very beginning she talks about the first sort of moral teaching a parent should give his or her child is to walk through the garden and to point out the beautiful flowers and to say, "Ooh, isn't that beautiful? Don't touch." Right? That's moral training. And it begins with such simple stuff like that. So anyway, that's a little homilet to say your conscience has to be formed. And the Catechism's clear on this. Conscience must be informed and moral judgment enlightened. A well-formed conscience is upright and truthful. It formulates judgments according to reason, in conformity with the true good willed by the wisdom of the Creator. The education of conscience is indispensable for human beings who are subjected to negative influence and tempted by sin to prefer their own judgment and to reject authoritative teachings. Again, think in the background what I began with. The ancient concept of freedom and the modern concept of freedom, right? Now, you're beginning to, if you follow me, you're beginning to see why the Catholic Church is often the big bad Catholic Church, right? So anyway, all this, as I said, makes sense to anybody who's ever tried to raise children. If you introduce your kids to the values of family or society, it'll go one way, not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, or you can just leave it be and see what happens, right? But the purpose of a church, the purpose of a family, the purpose of a school is to introduce, to induct, to form children in moral truth, right? And again, from a Catholic school standpoint, just to look at that topic, if you read the charter deeds of Catholic education, like what the church actually thinks she's doing with Catholic schools, she is quite clear, right, that we are extending the Greek and European tradition of moral inquiry, period. We have a concept of what the human person is. We think it's right, from Aristotle to Thomas to JP2. And when you come into the school system in a Catholic school, we're not arguing about that. We're forming you in that. Does it kind of make sense? And Catholic schools, some of them understand that, some of them don't, right? Here at St. Rita, we're trying to make sure that everybody is on board. Otherwise, they're whatever. But anyway, so that's an aside. So moving on, it's at this point that the Catholic Church's teaching on conscience gets a little bit complicated, right? So far, it's pretty simple: heart, synderesis, habit, act, all that stuff. But it gets a little bit tricky here, and it becomes fodder for all sorts of misunderstanding and often misrepresentation. And sometimes I wonder how willful that misrepresentation is. And I'll try to be clear, but undoubtedly, you might have to wrestle with this for a while before you get it. So we've seen how conscience is part of human nature, and that it's the place where God speaks to the person, and where we speak to God. It's the faculty whereby we come to know the truth, right? And so conscience, the church teaches, is sacred. It's a sacred thing, right? And so therefore, because it's sacred, in one sense, at one level, your conscience must be obeyed, right? And we talk about this. I need to obey my conscience. The church talks about this here. It says a human being must always obey the certain judgment of his conscience. If he were deliberately to act against it, he would condemn himself, right? Yet it can happen that moral conscience remains in ignorance and makes erroneous judgments about acts to be performed or already committed, right? So a person, it says, must obey the certain judgment of his conscience. Nonetheless, his or her conscience may be mistaken, right? And so the question is, of course, well, what then, right? What if, for example, the certain judgment of a person's conscience approves of killing an innocent person, right? Is the church saying here that we should honor the killer's conscience simply because, the killer is being conscientious? Is that what the church is saying? No. Rather, the church is saying, very, very importantly, that the person cannot be judged for the very act of obeying his or her conscience, right? The church says that we can't condemn a person for obeying, the act of obeying his or her conscience, right? A person can be judged or hopefully prevented from doing something evil like murder, because murder is wrong. It's always wrong. It's just that the person's guilt depends on his or her intention and not necessarily on the act itself, right? JP2 in the next paragraph clarifies things a little. He says, conscience is not an infallible judge. It can make mistakes. That's a very important thing right there. However, error of conscience can be the result of an invincible ignorance, an ignorance of which the subject is not aware and which he is unable to overcome by himself. In cases where such invincible ignorance is not culpable, conscience does not lose its dignity, right? That's a very important thing to say right there. Because even when it directs us to an act in a way not in conformity with the objective moral order, it continues to speak in the name of that truth about the good which the subject is called to seek sincerely. Now, that takes reading and almost meditation, right? So a person, for example, can be held accountable for murder even if the person is mistaken but certain in his or her judgment, and if because of ignorance his or her conscience allows the crime. But the person's culpability level, level of responsibility, depends on how well he or she knew what they were doing was wrong, right? So think, for example, when I talk about this often, or I don't talk about this often actually, but whenever I do, I think about the practitioner of human sacrifice, right? To use a radical example. The objective act of murder there, killing the poor, sacrificial victim, is always wrong. Our understanding of the evil of killing an innocent human being is constant, right? But our judgment of the killer's culpability depends on the person and the situation. So the Mayan high priest, for example, he's about to bring the knife down on some poor schmuck. The human sacrifice for the Mayan priest was part of the moral order, right? But we would say, and maybe this is a bold claim for some, that moral order was wrong. Objectively wrong, right? Human sacrifice, not a good thing. And when the Christians came and said, stop that, I think that was a good thing, But what of the culpability of the Mayan high priest, right? He's just, that's his day job. You see what I'm saying? And so the Mayan high priest performing human sacrifice, the church would say, is a victim himself of invincible ignorance. Killing the human person, wrong. We need to stop that, right? Is he a murderer? Kind of, yeah. But not in the same way you and I would be if we did it, right? Because we know, right? So it all depends on, how a person is or is not morally formed and informed. But we can't use invincible ignorance as an out. We are all responsible, and this is where it really sort of convicts us. And this is where I think a lot of us sort of, will get sort of grabbed by the scruff of the neck at some point. We're all responsible for our own moral formation, right? We may not be fully guilty of a crime, but we may be fully guilty of not taking advantage of the availability of moral truth, right? That's an important thing to think about. The Catechism here says, this ignorance can often be imputed to personal responsibility. Why don't you know this, right? Why don't you know this? Well, I was watching TV. Well, okay. Anyway, so this is the case when a man takes little trouble to find out what is true and good, or when conscience is by degrees almost blinded through the habit of committing sin. In such cases, the person is culpable for the evil he commits. So the best example of this, as far as I'm concerned, is if you read Hannah Arendt's, the second time I've mentioned her tonight, her extremely haunting book called Eichmann in Jerusalem, which is her, I think it's for the New Yorker, her reportage on Adolf Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem in the early 60s. Adolf Eichmann was the sort of bureaucrat responsible for the final solution, right? And he was just a normal guy, kind of like you and I, white-collar guy, nothing too spectacular about him. He was a paper pusher, but he, was the logistics guy for the extermination of millions and millions of Jews. And so Hannah Arendt, who herself is a Jewish philosopher, sort of is asking herself, why on earth is this guy so evil, right? Why did this guy participate in this, millennial, epochal, I should say, wickedness? And the subtitle of the book is A Report on the Banality of Evil. And her basic claim is that Adolf Eichmann was so sort of unreflective about his moral environment. He just didn't really think much about anything other than getting him going to work in the morning and this, that, and the other. And on page 31 of that book, she talks about, his choice to join the SS. And she says he was so sort of morally pliant. Not a bad guy, not a good guy, just kind of went with the flow. That when the question was put to him, why don't you join the SS? The only thing Adolf Eichmann could say in response was, why not? Right? And that is what, it's a haunting book, and that's, for me, the most haunting part of the book. But that's what this passage is talking about, right? You may not understand, that this is right or that is wrong, but if you never took the time to look into it, you could be guilty for that. Does that kind of make sense? So anyway, that's an aside. So the takeaway here is conscience is sacred. It's a gift. It's part of us, but it's not infallible. Not infallible at all, right? If every conscience was infallible, then that would essentially deny the possibility of truth, right? But if we see conscience as sacred and as something to be cherished and formed, then we take conscience and we take the moral life a little bit more seriously. We grow up pretty much, as Ratzinger says, in his wonderful brief little book called On Conscience, which is a really, if you want to read anything read that. This is what he says. He says, to put it differently, the identification of conscience with superficial consciousness, the reduction of man to his subjectivity, does not liberate but enslaves. Again, this classical notion of freedom versus the modern notion of freedom. It makes us totally dependent on the prevailing opinions and debases these with every passing day. Whoever equates conscience with superficial conviction identifies conscience with a pseudo-rational certainty that in fact has been woven from self-righteousness, conformity, and lethargy. Conscience is degraded to a mechanism for rationalization, which it should, while it should represent the transparency of the subject for the divine, and thus constitute the very dignity and the greatness of the human person. Right? That, I suggest, is the modern problem. Right? That names and shames us, I think. So anyway, moving on to talk about the relationship of the church and conscience. We'll finish with some thoughts. So again, just to recall that earlier distinction between the classical idea of freedom and the modern idea of freedom and how that changed. Classically, freedom was choosing well in accordance with truth for human flourishing. In modern thought, freedom is just plain choice, right? Choice for choice's sake. In the light of the modern notion of freedom, any entity outside of ourselves, whether it's a parent, a boss, the state, the church, it appears only to limit our freedom by giving us laws or prohibitions or taboos or warnings or even advice. Again, this is why in modernity I think you have the ubiquitous phenomenon of advertising, right? It is everywhere, right? Why? Because that's how we understand freedom, right? Because if freedom is just the freedom to choose and has nothing to do with the intellect or will, then it's all persuasion, right? And so, as JP2 described here, it's in that environment that we have a hard time understanding the church's role as moral teacher, right? So look at these two paragraphs. He says, today, however, it seems necessary to reflect on the whole of the church's moral teaching with the precise goal of recalling certain fundamental truths of Catholic doctrine, which in the present circumstances risk being distorted or denied. In fact, a new situation has come about within the church's community, within the Christian community itself, which has experienced the spread of numerous doubts and objections of a human and psychological and social and cultural, religious and even properly theological nature with regard to the church's moral teachings. It is no longer a matter of limited and occasional dissent, but of an overall and systematic calling into question of traditional moral doctrine on the basis of certain anthropological and ethical presuppositions. So he's attacking a certain sort of modern framework there, which we don't need to go into. But the next paragraph, he says, at the root of these presuppositions is the more or less obvious influence of currents of thought which end by detaching human freedom from its essential and constitutive relationship to the truth. Thus, the traditional doctrine regarding the natural law and the universality and the permanent validity of its precepts is rejected. Certain of the church's moral teachings are found simply unacceptable, and the magisterium, that is the teaching office of the church itself, is considered capable of intervening in matters of morality only in order to, quote, exhort consciences and to, quote, propose values, in light of which each individual will independently make his or her own decisions and choices. So what John Paul II is saying is that in light of our modern idea of freedom, people have tried to say that the church is just one, advertiser among others of morality, right? That the church's job is to exhort consciences or to propose values for you to consider and take on, right? because the primal ideology is your free will, right? And that's different, JP2 is saying, than understanding the church as teacher of truth. It's a different ballgame, right? That subtle difference is big, JP2 is saying. And why would we dare call the church a teacher of truth? How do we get off saying that? Well, the church is the body of Christ. The church is the body of Christ, right? It is, in her essence, as we said at the very beginning, the communion of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Right? Like we believe that. That's like, theologically, that's what we hold, you know? And so therefore, when the magisterium speaks, when the church speaks articulately, like when we come across in a few weeks when we start diving into Evangelium Vitae and you see some of the stuff that JP2 says, and he says, as the successor of Peter, boom. That's the church as the teacher of truth. Not the church as, hey, I'd like you to consider, right? And we believe that about the church because the church is the body of Christ, right? And JP2's whole point is that we've forgotten that the church doesn't offer or sell advice. She teaches truth. Big difference, right? And it's this demoted view of the church, right? That the church might be some sort of ancient or revered sort of proposer of good, you know. It's a degraded view which sort of goes hand in hand with another sort of strange view of the church as a disconnected entity. Ratzinger describes it, he says, there is a rather common impression that the church is not in a position to respond in a correct manner to reality in today's world. Instead of listening to the language of reality, she is immovably chained to antiquated points of view that she tries to impose on men and women. Right here, a conflict arises between the bishop and the expert. In many ways, this conflict appears to be a conflict between a doctrine that is distant from reality and an exact understanding of current reality. Just as an aside, you know, whenever I used to teach RCIA, I used to say, I've said this in homilies before, that you know, each of us has our thing which we sort of don't understand, or people disagree with the church about this, that, or the other thing, which is okay, the church can handle it. But the reality is, I suggest, 99% of the time, the church understands why you disagree with her better than you do. Think about that. The church understands why you disagree with her better than you do. One, because she's got a lot of smart people in the church. And because she has this deeper sort of understanding of the human person and of the nature of truth and the intellect. But that's another matter. The church's view of herself as opposed to, you know, moral advertiser or propagandist, as I said, is theologically grounded in her understanding of herself as the communion of Christ, who is truth, right? You get this in JP2's teaching from Vatican II's document on Dignitatis Humanae. So here's JP2. He says, Christians have a great help for the formation of conscience in the church and in her magisterium. As the Council affirms, this is Dignitatis Humanae, in forming their consciences, the Christian faithful must give careful attention to the sacred and certain teaching of the church. For the Catholic Church is, by the will of Christ, the teacher of truth. Her charge is to announce and teach authentically that truth which is Christ, and at the same time, with her authority, to declare and confirm the principles of the moral order which derive from human nature itself. It follows that the authority of the church, which, when she pronounces on moral questions, in no way undermines the freedom of conscience of Christians. Again, he's countering that sort of modern idea of freedom. This is so not only because freedom of conscience is never freedom from the truth, but always freedom in the truth. Again, this extremely important. But also because the magisterium does not bring to the Christian conscience truths which are extraneous to it. Rather, it brings to light the truths which it ought already to possess, and developing them from the starting point of the primordial act of faith. The church puts herself always and only at the service of conscience, helping it to avoid being tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine proposed by human deceit, and helping it not to swerve from the truth about the good of man, but rather, especially in more difficult questions, to attain the truth with certainty and to abide in it. So the church is not, JP2 is saying, as I said, a moral advertiser, but the teacher of truth. But when the church teaches truth, he goes on to say, she's not inventing it. The church cannot invent the truth. Rather, she's bringing to light truth which we, with our morally formed consciences, should already possess. So how does this make sense in light of this classical notion of freedom as choosing well, right? The church is that organism, that communion, that body of Christ, which by grace gives witness to the truth and to life as it should be. She doesn't invent the truth. She doesn't invent moral rules. She witnesses to a bigger truth than nations, cultures, or governments. And now the thing is, this is a very bold claim, right? And again, as I was trying to become a Catholic myself, I think that's a big matzo ball out there, right? Is the Catholic Church the teacher of truth, right? Rather than just a nice old venerable institution with a guy with a white cassock in the middle of it, It's a bold claim, but it's theologically grounded that the church is the teacher of truth because she's the communion of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, because Christ, the truth, is within her, is manifest in her, enlivens her, right? And so in a sense, because we believe the body of Christ to be the church, we believe that when the church speaks, not when popes talk on planes or when Father preaches a homily that is obnoxious or good, right? But when the church speaks, we gotta understand what that means. Then it might be the body of Christ speaking, right? And that's the teacher of truth, right? And so anyway, JP2 says, when people ask the church the questions raised by their consciences, when the faithful in the church turn to their bishops and pastors, the church's reply contains the voice of Jesus Christ, the voice of truth about good and evil. In the words spoken by the church, there resounds in people's inmost being the voice of God who alone is good and who alone is love, right? And so, we don't have time to talk about sort of how you grade the statements of the church, right? As I said, if I get up there and just shoot off the hip, that's not sort of inerrant. It's not. It might be good, might be bad, might be truthful, might be I've had a bad day, and that's all the way up to the Pope, right? But there are certain circumstances in which the church does speak, and she'll tell you when she's speaking authoritatively, and at that point, she's the teacher of truth, right? And that's where assent and obedience kick in. Does it kind of make sense? But that's another topic. As Ratzinger notes, if Christ speaks, to continue the theme, in and through the church, then the voice of the church is, and this is my basic point I want to make, is more than advertising, and so therefore it does demand a level of respect. It says, if I believe, Ratzinger says, if I believe that the church has its origins in the Lord, then the teaching office in the church has a right to expect that it, as it authentically develops, will be accepted as a priority factor in the formation of conscience. there corresponds to this an obligation of the magisterium to speak its word in such a way that it will be understood in the midst of conflicts in values and orientations. And the church often is not very good at that at all, right? So what is he saying? He says the church has a right to expect that she will be heard by the faithful because she is the teacher of truth, right? Which is the exact same thing as me saying, I expect my daughters, plural now, ton of them, to listen to what I say. Why? Because I'm their dad. Does that make sense? Exact same function. But as I said, the church. This is where the church makes some big claims, and this is also where the church invites ridicule, right? And a lot of scorn, especially in those times when the church and the present culture differ so much. Nonetheless, the church has always in the past and always will in the future hold the line, right? Even if it has to oppose almost everything. This rather haunting line from Benedict XVI, Ratzinger, he says, on the other hand, the teaching office of the church must defend man against himself to prevent his destruction, even if this means opposing the philosophy of an entire epoch. Think about that. Even if it means opposing the entire philosophy of an entire epoch. So how do you think it's going to go down? Your arguments about Thomas Aquinas in the church. So anyway, to rescore the point that the church does not invent moral rules out of thin air. The church is not an authoritarian regime, no matter how many times it's misconstrued in the media as being so. For those of us on the inside of the church, sometimes I wish that the church was more authoritarian than she is. If she was more authoritarian, we'd be a lot more efficient, right? The church is a witness to truth as the body of Christ, and so she shows the path to freedom in that classical sense by way of truth. And she's not a force limiting freedom, even when she tells you no. Rather, she shows us what is the good and the true and the beautiful, right? What's truly good for us, right? And again, that's some even for me sometimes a hard pill to swallow. Ratzinger goes on just to hammer on the point. He says the Pope cannot impose commandments on faithful Catholics because he wants to or finds it expedient. Such a modern voluntaristic concept of authority can only distort the true theological meaning of the papacy. It's a very profound thing to say. He's talking about how even good Catholics across the political spectrum, left and right, misunderstand the papacy because they have this modern assumption about what freedom is, right? And so they can't help but conceive of something like the papacy as an authoritarian power, and he might be Benedict XVI and you love him, or he might be Pope Francis and you hate him. You see what I'm saying? They both have this sort of voluntaristic notion of authority, which is problematic, Ratzinger says. Which is also probably why it boggles the mind of some people that Benedict XVI and Francis actually get along. It's like, why is that? Because they're smarter than we are. But anyway, that's an aside. The last thing from Ratzinger says that the true sense of the teaching authority of the Pope consists in his being the advocate of Christian memory. I love that line. The Pope does not impose from without, rather he elucidates the Christian memory and defends it. For this reason, the toast to conscience indeed must precede the toast to the Pope. That's a reference to a Newman story. Because without conscience, there would not be the papacy. All power that the papacy has is the power of conscience. a very interesting thing to say, but we got to move on. So finally, recalling our first thoughts about freedom, classical freedom versus modern freedom, freedom cannot be separated from the truth. Freedom just for freedom's sake, separated from the truth, is actually the enslavement of the mind. And that's just not a Christian thing. Pagans would have told you the same. It's just delusional bondage. When we separate freedom from the truth, and this is sort of the side effect, when we separate freedom from truth, that's where you begin to conceive of a faith separated from morality. Because you can be faithful just because you say you're faithful, just because you choose to be faithful, right? Because you've detached truth from your concept of freedom. And this is an ancient problem, but the circumstances in which this problem exists in modernity are different. And that is, the issue of people calling themselves Christians who actually don't live the Christian life. It says this attempt, this is JP2, the attempt to set freedom in opposition to truth, and indeed to separate them radically, is the consequence, manifestation, and consummation of another more serious and destructive dichotomy which separates faith from morality. That's what I'm talking about. He goes on, he says, this separation represents one of the most acute pastoral concerns of the church amid today's growing secularism, wherein many, indeed too many, people think and live as if God did not exist, functional atheists. We are speaking of a mentality which affects, often in a profound, extensive, and all-embracing way, even the attitudes and behavior of Christians, whose faith is weakened and loses its character as a new and original criterion for thinking and acting in personal, family, and social life. In a widely de-Christianized culture, the criteria employed by believers themselves in making judgments and decisions often appear extraneous or even contrary to those of the gospel, right? And he's not the only one who's been saying this. Tons of people have been saying this in the 20th century and to today. Jacques Ellul, for example, who's my sort of favorite, great Protestant thinker who wrote this book called The Presence of the Kingdom, where, he talked about, he says, in the West we won the material war, but we've lost the spiritual war. And that's because you can't tell Christians apart from non-Christians. Sociologically, they're all the same, right? And this is basically what JP2 is saying. JP2 argued the problem for him is that if you think the highest human good is simply living freely according to your own, perhaps idiosyncratic counsel, right? Counting your own certainty for the truth instead of God's law, and the whole edifice of truth which is revealed in Scripture and in natural law. If you really you're sucked into this modern idea of freedom, then you will begin to think clearly that you can be a Christian while living like a pagan, right? Why? Because the truth ultimately doesn't matter. Only your choice to be a Christian matters, which is why, and as I'm sort of calling the game, I think you can see Christians become atheists overnight. It's because philosophically they've been atheists for a very long time already, right? You can still cheat on your wife, you can neglect the poor, you can abort your children, you can do all these things that millennia of Christians knew just instinctively were evil. You can do those things today and still live happily as a Christian, simply because you choose to be, because you've detached free will and you've elevated that as your concept of freedom. That's absolute utter nonsense. But it's true for a lot of us, right? Which is quite haunting. And so finally, just to conclude with an urgent appeal, and I've been quoting from an encyclical, which is very important, very sort of philosophical, but worth your time, Veritatis Splendor. He says, we conclude with, it says, it is urgent then that Christians should rediscover the newness of the faith and its power to judge a prevalent and all-intrusive culture. As the Apostle Paul admonishes us, once you were in darkness, but now you are light in the Lord, walk as children of the light, for the fruit of the light is found in all that is good and right and true. And try to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of the time because the days are evil. And just to keep going, he says, it is urgent to rediscover and to set forth once more the authentic reality of the Christian faith, which is not simply a set of propositions to be accepted with intellectual assent. Rather, faith is a lived knowledge of Christ, a living remembrance of his commandments, and a truth to be lived out. A word in any event is not truly received until it passes into action, until it is put into practice. Faith is a decision involving one's whole existence. It is an encounter, a dialogue, a communion of love and of life between the believer and Jesus Christ, the way, the truth, and the life. It entails an act of trusting abandonment to Christ, which enables us to live as he lived in profound love of God and of our brothers and sisters. And so that's part of a large exhortation in the encyclical where JP2 is basically telling us, we Christians today, to buckle up and remember that you're Christians. You're different, right? And we're supposed to be different, and we should not be bashful about it. We should just get on with it, right? And remember what the church is. And so again, that's a bold claim, right? And some people accept it and some people don't. I certainly came to accept it, and because I'm here. But that's the thing. And we'll see this play out over the next 4 talks. The next 2 talks, we're going to look at the church's social teaching, where it comes from the Old Testament, and it's going to take us all the way to Leo the 13th, and even beyond. And then we're going to pick up with JP2's Evangelium Vitae, which if you read the beginning of Evangelium Vitae, paragraph 5, JP2 invokes the church's social teaching. All of it is the question, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? And to be sure, the Catholic Church asks that question with utterly annoying consistency, right? Even to many of her dear Catholics. And so that's the teacher of truth in action, as we'll see over the next several times. So thank you all very much.